Our final presenter for today is Luba Pirgova from Cardiff University. The title of her presentation is The Bulgarian School of Semiotics, Using Folklore to Understand Energy.
University. I'm affiliated with the Energy Biographies project there, and I also am part of the Understanding Risk research group that deals with studies of climate change and global warming, and we're affiliated also with the timber sectors. So hopefully that will give a bit of a direction as to how we look at the world. My PhD is about trying to study images of electricity. So how people perceive energy and electricity, and how those perceptions are based in their cultural upbringing or cultural context. Now, the structure of this presentation is first I'm going to take a look at what exactly are images. So what am I really talking about, and why images? And then I'm going to take a look at what semiotics are, and hopefully explain how they can help me learn more about images of electricity. And then bring up the question of folklore. What in the world does that have to do with anything? And then I will focus on one example, which is on nuclear waste disposal, before concluding with some final remarks. It all ties all together well, I promise. So, why images of electricity? Electricity is invisible. We cannot see it. It has no physical form. However, one of the things we can study about electricity are its images. What we think electricity is, what we think it does, and what kind of impact we think it might have on us. Therefore, images of electricity can be seen as individual or group representations, or interpretations, which in turn are communicated through some sort or medium of representation. Just to explain, so there are many different types of images. So images are not just pictures. They can be anything that we can sense with any of our five senses. For example, when you step out of your house and you smell freshly cut grass, the smell indicates that someone has cut their grass. So the smell actually tells you an occurrence or an event that has happened somewhere around you. Essentially, the smell is the image, or frequently in text, signs. That's what they're referred to. My PhD then has a multimodal approach. I look at a whole variety of different images. I look at anything from visual to narrative, to anything else I can really get my hands on. I studied two specific case studies where energy has been lost. And the reason for that is because when energy is lost, people produce images of electricity because they start talking about it. They start thinking about why they miss it, so they produce them, and I study these productions. The two cases I look at are Hurricane Sandy, which represents a very quick energy loss, that impacted over 8 million households. And my second case is the Bulgarian energy protests, and just to clarify, those are before the political turn of events, from about February to April 2013, where the theme of the protests was energy. Later on they became politicized, and that is seen as a completely different event. In both of these cases, I look at a lot of visual data, video materials, as well as narrative data. What is interesting, however, is when I conducted a thematic analysis in both of these cases. For example, in the Sandy event, people kept talking about Sandy as though she is human. She's this great big villain that came over, swept through, and created all this distress and chaos, and left people as victims. In the Bulgarian energy protests, similarly, people weren't just walking down the street, shouting mafia or whatever they might have been shouting. But they also did a lot of theatrical performances. People had coffins, which they carried with them. There were kukiri dancing down the street, drummers, musicians, singing. A lot of different folkloric elements, heroes and villains, in both of these cases. And what in the world do they have to do with energy, right? Which is why I started looking at semiotics. I started looking at all of these things and occurrences of science. And semiotics is the study of science. There are many different definitions definitions, which all kind of go around what a sign is, that tend to go quite technical. But the simplest thing, which I think is quite to the point, is by Pierce, saying that a sign is something that stands to somebody or something in some respect or some capacity. Essentially, every thought is a sign, similar to what I was trying to explain with the images. Anything through the five senses, as long as it stands in for something else and it tells us something, a message, an idea, a thought. For example, if you see a traffic light, you look at the red, and we've been taught red means stop, green means go. The traffic light gives us signals as drivers to know whether to drive, as walkers to know when we can cross. And here comes the problem. Many signs are symbolic signs. So they have cultural aspects. The cultural context determines whether we know what they are. A traffic light here, we know how to deal with it. In India, they just drive all over the place. Similar with something as a nod. Because most of you here are Bulgarians, you know that when you want to say yes in Bulgaria, you go like this. When you want to say yes here, you go like this.
No.
Without knowing the cultural context, you actually have problems communicating. And I've been down that road where someone's been asking me, can you pass me the sugar? And I go like that, and they just look at me, why are you so rude? Which is why semioticians look at something called the semiosis, which is the process by which a culture produces these signs, or attributes meanings to these signs. They can occur through social activity, or it can also be individual acts. They can be spontaneous, such as the cross. An event happened, then that symbol became part of the mainstream, and we know that it's a symbol of Christianity. But then they could be created. For example, as the corporate creation, we all know the iconic golden arches of McDonald's, and what they stand for, fast food. The interesting thing about the semiosis, though, is that it has three very important elements. The linguistic capability, which comes from the French school semiotics. They focus on language, system or language use, but how we use language to communicate. Cognitive processes, which comes from the American school of semiotics, which looks at how we internalize, how we think, how our thought process thinks about signs, how we interpret things. And then there's the cultural context. Lotman and the Russian schools basically argue that without understanding the context, signs are meaningless because they can have an infinite messages or meanings attached to them. So you need to know the cultural context in order to interpret them appropriately. And that's where we come to the Bulgarian school of semiotics. That's what I call it. There are a series of Bulgarians, led by Christian Markov at the Bulgarian University in Bulgaria, who actually take a look at all these three different aspects. And they conduct, I would say, a holistic approach in their writings, where they incorporate all three in balance. They argue that it's important to balance the linguistic capability as well as the cognitive process in the cultural context in order to truly understand what a sign stands for, what it means to us. For them, semiotics actually is defined as the theory of interpretation, rather than the study of science. And I'm going to try to put this into a practical example. Semiotics have not actually been applied that much to the field of energy. There have been quite a few studies recently from Saffron O'Neill on climate change. But the only study that I know of in existence is this study from WIP, on the WIP project, which is the Waste Isolation Pilot Project. It was a project that was done in the US where they created an old salt mine that was converted into a storage device for nuclear waste radioactive disposal. They're going to keep filling up this mine up until the year of 2035, whereupon this mine has to be sealed. And here comes the question. It has to be sealed for 10,000 years. But how exactly do you tell people to stay away from it? How do you actually get them to not enter this radioactive area? Because over time, there's a change in language, there's changes in interpretive mechanisms, and most certainly there's cultural evolutions, and in some cases devolutions. If we, for example, want to move away from technology, then what happens? How do we understand this area? And we all know you cannot just put on a sign that says stay away. Because we know how well that worked out for the pharaohs, right? With the two murders in the 20th century. It just doesn't work. people are just too curious. So then they put together a series of panels, and on these panels they had semioticians, linguists, they had physicists, engineers, they even had science fiction writers, to try to come up with some sort of a sign that tells people to stay away. Because 10,000 years is equal to 300 generations, so you need to find a way to pass this knowledge through to these generations. Now, the technical ability was the site itself to look dangerous, hopefully it will keep people away, or to have high technical ability was the idea put forth by Kowalski. That has quite a lot of problems because it doesn't really answer the question of human curiosity, nor does it actually address people wanting to take over. Some people said, well, we need to put concentric pattern in new editions of linguistic warnings. So say in Russian, Chinese, and English, stay away. And then each year keep adding new and new languages to the group. But who's going to keep adding? So there is quite problematic. How do you keep the knowledge alive? Then Semiotics actually suggested creating an atomic priesthood, something like the Catholic Church, to pass down the knowledge of please stay away from here. And this priesthood would get almost mythicized in folk tales in order for it to have this power and control over the centuries to be able to tell people to stay away. Len, who's actually a science fiction person here, and yet he has a rather, how do I say, more normalized idea, is to create an artificial satellite which would keep projecting through the night sky to tell us the story of stay away from this area. Of course, in order for this to work, that satellite once again has to be turned into some sort of a myth for people to keep paying attention to it. And then, of course, my favorite one is the radiation ray cats. A special breed of cats, because cats are considered to be the only domestic animal that has kept its, I would say, domestic status over the last thousands of years, and it seems like it will continue to do so in the same way. So dogs, horses, they've all changed in status, but cats have not. Ergo, we're going to play around with the DNA of some cats and get them to change color whenever they come into contact with radiation. Once again, though, the idea is that these cats would have to be mythicized. They would have to become part of folktales, so that you learn that if you see a green cat or a red cat or whatever the radioactive color is going to be, you need to stay away from the area where that cat's been. Of course, with the black cats and the witches, we also know all about that one. Luckily for us, they got about 40 more years to figure this out, but so far this is where they are. But what all of these suggestions have in common is that they all depend on this notion of folklore, that they have to create these myths in order to be able to pass these very important messages about this nuclear radioactive waste, and that we need to stay away from it for an X period of time, and why, hopefully. This theoretically placed actually is, there is kind of context for it. The Russian semiotician Vladimir Prop wrote something called the Morphology of Fairy Tales, where he found out that the reason why this mythology and fairy tale theme keeps coming up is because regardless of culture, people tend to tell their stories in the same way. Now, his study was actually on Russian fairy tales, where he took a look and he saw that there are what he calls them functions, 31 things that a story has to go through. They may not all occur at the same time, but they will occur in a specific order. Later on, his theories have actually been adapted for anything and everything underneath the sun, including James Bond films, my favorite interpretation. But what it tells you is that people tend to respond to fairy tales. They tend to respond to narratives and folklore. And the argument that can be made is they can respond to that more than they can to other linguistic attempts at communication or other visual attempts at communication. Which is how this applies to my PhD. As I explained, in both Hurricane Sandy and the Bulgarian energy protests, folklore was used as a communication medium. People were using it to actually talk about energy and electricity. The stories of villains and heroes, good versus evil, imaginary reality, identity, morals, ethics, lessons to be learned, all of that together was shown by a variety of theoretical performances, rituals, narratives, all sorts of videos and other visual creations. So using the holistic approach of the Bulgarian school of semiotics, which looks at the linguistic, cognitive and cultural, I can study the folklore in both of these case studies and how it relates to energy. And the folklore used, I would argue, carries the series of signs that can provide further insight and knowledge into people's perceptions of energy and electricity. Thank you for listening.
I would like to thank you both for a very rich presentation. I'm still trying to connect all the elements into some sort of meaningful chain. So, any questions? Yes?
Yeah, even though your example with the cat would be a very hypothetical proposition, would it cause like other issues as making cats change their status from being like a very homey creature than to actually become like this thing that just brings bad luck to you because it's going to start shining red every time it goes close to any sort of radiation source?
Well, the reason why they chose the cat is they basically needed a creature that would not change and that they can manipulate. They could try to manipulate a breed of people, but I don't think that's going to go too well. Which is why I think they were trying to find an animal that has preserved its status in a way. And yet, despite all of the bad images around the black cat, the cat is still a very prominent household item. So, in a way, it was a way to try to attempt to have something constant through time that would be able to remain in people's context, what they see every day in their environment. So by creating the myths around it, they were hoping that they would be able to pass the message through these cats, because clearly just linguistically writing it wouldn't work.
Okay, yes?
In relation to the previous question, isn't it a little bit dangerous to tie the story to a horror, for example, or something which is related to the perception? To imagine that after 1,000 years we stop seeing red or something like this, then what's going to happen?
I don't know what's going to happen. Also because there is the inherent hope that different cultures see different colors differently. So we've been taught, for example, some people see red as a very different spectrum. One of the reasons why, for example, red, yellow, and green are the chosen colors, however, is because there is less disparity. But it by no means means that it does not exist. So as you can tell, all of these are solutions that are proposed, but all of them have inherent hope. And basically, the reason why I used that specific case to illustrate is I was trying to see how people have seen the semiotics as both, I suppose, problematic, because how do you create this sign, but also trying to find the solutions by looking at the different types of signs. Some are linguistic, but also trying to see how people are going to interpret things in the future, as well as the physical appearances and everything else that really goes into it, and the context. So trying to adhere to a context that hopefully will not change too much.
Have you tried to search some patterns in the semantic of these myths and stories?
It's not being applied to energy. The thing is, semiotics tends to be applied more in the fields of education or languages, because one of the problems is the Bulgarian school of semiotics is unique in the respect that it looks at all three of these aspects. The French school that follows Saussure does tend to focus on language a little too much. So they tend to exclude anything really outside of it. Pierce, which is then followed by Echo, is so much in the cognitive processes that because they're trying to almost run away from language, but also once again ignoring the cultural context. But what creates the biggest difficulty is because of the language barrier. The Russian school is not being able to communicate to the other two very well. But the Bulgarians are in this very unique position to be able to read Russian while having quite close ties to the other two schools, which is why they've been able to develop this holistic approach.
Perhaps that would be the final question, yes?
So when you say folklore, I would imagine that the word novel would carry quite a lot of generations down, given that it's somewhere that you can't go for I don't know how many thousands of years, which is quite a lot.
You'd be surprised actually, because my research group, Understanding Risk, did a study recently which was about attitudes of people that live near nuclear power plants. And it was very surprising that once it becomes part of your normalized existence, you don't tend to see it as this shock and horror that people will actually have to live with it every day do. It becomes normalized. And when it's normalized, you no longer have the same reaction to it. You almost learn to live with the bad. It becomes a background noise. And then the reflection about it goes away. And after some time, once the reflection is gone, it's gone for good. So there's probably going to be a time when we will forget Germany. The same way many people have actually forgotten 3 Mile Island already. Which was the first of the 3 great disasters. 3 Mile Island being the first, Chernobyl the second, and then Fukushima the third. And a lot of people have already forgotten it, and it wasn't that long ago. So once it gets that status, unfortunately, it might get lost.
Okay, well, I think we can continue the conversation over coffee. So let me thank you both for really interesting answers. So thank you very much.